Everyone, I am Helen Miller. I am Director of the IFS. I'm delighted to welcome you to this event this morning. Thank you to all of you who came in person. Thank you to everyone who's joining us online. I have the very pleasant job today of chairing today's sessions and to listening to all of the wonderful work we're going to hear. Much of what you hear this morning draws from work that was recently published in a special issue of Fiscal Studies. We're very much kicking off the day with a look at what is known about regional inequalities. Then after the break, Andy Burnham and others will kick us off with a discussion about what we do in policy in this space. I'm going to say very little to save time for all the speakers. I'm going to introduce our first four speakers in the order in which they'll speak. Then I'm going to sit down. They'll all come up and do their bit, and then at the end we'll have time to take questions from all of you. So we're going to first hear from Sonia Krujkova, who is our Deputy Research Director at IFS and a Professor at the University of Manchester. We'll then hear from Xiaowei Zhu, who is also a colleague of mine at the IFS. Then from Peter Lavelle, also of the IFS, also a Deputy Research Director. And then last but by no means least, from Philip McCann, who is Chair of Urban and Regional Economics at the Manchester Business School. So each of those will speak in that order, and then we'll have time for questions from all of you, so get your questions ready. But for now, let me hand over to Sonia. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Helen. Okay, so I'm going to start with talking about geographic inequalities and opportunity, and this is joint work with several co-authors at the IFS and beyond. So just starting from something that we know, UK is among the more spatially unequal countries in the OECD. By some measures, one of the most spatially unequal countries. And that is across a whole bunch of domains. So we can look at health and life expectancy, we can look at education and skills, we can look at pay and productivity and others, and that has been documented, increasingly being documented, including in work by the IFS. Now, an important feature of these inequalities is their persistence. So places with low wages and employment 20 years ago, 30 years ago, continue to be places that are still struggling today. And so understanding this persistence is going to be an important part of designing appropriate policies to reduce geographic inequalities. Now, there are different scenarios here, okay? In one scenario, it may be that inequalities between places persist because some places have persistently worse local conditions. For example, weak labour markets, okay? And everybody in that place is affected by that. And Philip's work is going to speak to some of what might drive that. Alternatively, and these are not mutually exclusive, but you may have a scenario where persistence is being fueled by very strong intergenerational persistence of disadvantage. And that's going to be due to opportunities to overcome childhood disadvantage in a place. Now, the policy implications of these scenarios are potentially quite different. So in the first instance, we're talking about improving local conditions broadly for everybody. In the second instance, we're talking about improving opportunities to overcome childhood disadvantage. While we know a lot about spatial inequalities in outcomes, we actually don't know a lot about spatial variation in inequality of opportunity. And so this is what I'm going to focus on today. And in my talk, I'm really going to be documenting geographical differences in opportunities to overcome childhood disadvantage. And then I see some of the talks that are following as unpacking that a little bit, speaking about migration, speaking about the geography of private investment to kind of think more about what opportunity might entail. Okay, so geography of opportunity. I'm going to have two distinct but complementary measures that we're going to look at. The first one is going to be looking at differences across places in the degree to which childhood circumstances affect adult outcomes. Then the second measure is going to hone in on those specifically from disadvantaged backgrounds and look at how their outcomes vary across the country. So starting with that first measure, the degree to which childhood circumstances affect adult outcomes, what I'm specifically going to look at is the correlation between the socioeconomic status of the immediate neighborhood where one grows up and adult earnings at age 30. okay? So I'm going to do this. I want to look at variation across the country. So I'm going to calculate these correlations separately for each upper tier local authority. So I'm going to have 152 of them, and I'm going to be comparing them to understand these spatial patterns. Now, in local authorities where inequality of opportunity is low, this correlation is going to be low. Childhood circumstances are not going to be very predictive of adult outcomes. In local authorities where inequality of opportunity is high, this correlation is going to be strong, and childhood background is going to be an important determinant of outcomes in adulthood. Now, just briefly, I'm not talking about samples of people. I'm actually using government data. So this is about everybody focusing on cohorts born in the late 1980s. And I'm really focusing on where people grow up. I have nothing to say about where they end up. That's going to be something that Peter and Jiawei really focus on. So moving on to some of the results. So this map is showing these correlations between childhood circumstances and adult earnings across local authorities in England. Now, the yellow local authorities are the 20% of local authorities where this correlation is lowest, so inequality of opportunity is lowest. And the dark purple local authorities are the 20% where this correlation is highest. We do this analysis separately for men and women. That's one of the contributions we make. So we learn something here about stark gender differences as well. Focusing on men first, just highlighting the pattern of these areas with low inequality of opportunity, predominantly being in the south. So we can see areas inner London very much, Oxfordshire, going down to Devon, and as far up as Herefordshire. Now, the dark purple areas, so these are the places where inequality of opportunity is strongest, highest. For men, these are predominantly in the north, so very much clustered in the northwest, with also some areas in the northeast. Now, how big are these differences? Okay, so between these low and high inequality of opportunity areas. Well, if we take Blackpool, which is one of the purple local authorities, so one of the areas where inequality of opportunity is high, and we compare Blackpool to Camden, then the gap between those for disadvantaged and advantaged backgrounds in Blackpool is going to be 5 times greater than the gap in Camden. Now, what does that actually translate into? Where if we take this gap in Blackpool, we take a man in the middle of the earnings distribution, and we increase his earnings by the equivalent of this gap in Blackpool, earnings will go up by 64%. Okay, so this gap in Blackpool is substantial, and it being 5 times less is a substantial difference between places. For women, again, we have results where areas in the south, although slightly different areas in some cases, are the ones in the yellow group with low inequality of opportunity. But actually, the purple areas, unlike for men, are very spread out. So for women, these local authorities with high inequality of opportunity, we see them in Greater London, we see them down in Devon, we see them in Buckinghamshire, and going up to West Midlands in the northwest. So much more spread out pattern. But again, the differences between these top and bottom local authorities are meaningful and large. So significant geographic variation then in the degree to which childhood circumstances impact adult earnings. Moving on to the second measure, going to now focus just on those who are coming from disadvantaged backgrounds. Okay? And so what we're going to look at are people who grew up in equally disadvantaged neighborhoods, but in different local authorities, and think about how that's reflected in their earnings. So here are the maps. I'm going to be a bit more brief in describing these, but again, we see some differences in patterns for women and men. Strikingly for women, the local authorities where those from disadvantaged neighborhoods do best are very much concentrated in inner and greater London. And you can see that with that yellow dot in the middle. Those are all the London local authorities. For men, the local authorities where men are doing best are a little bit more spread out, still in the south. Now again, for women, those local authorities with the worst outcomes are geographically spread out across the country. For men, very much concentrated in the northwest, in Manchester, Merseyside, those areas. And again, as with the previous measure, these are big differences between these yellow local authorities and purple local authorities, okay? So if we look at the difference between in terms of earnings between a yellow and a purple local authority, it's equivalent to 55% of median earnings of women in this group. Smaller for men, 25% for men. So again, this is it's not just that there is variation, we would expect that, but this is a significant variation. So what do we learn? As Helen mentioned, this work has been published in a paper, and there are a number of takeaways there. I'm going to highlight 3, but I think there's broader findings there that might be of interest. First of all, there is a clear north-south pattern. We saw that yellow areas are predominantly, so these areas where inequality of opportunity is lower, where outcomes of those from disadvantaged backgrounds are better. Those areas are concentrated in the south, but that's not the whole story. We're not just talking about the north-south divide. We do have significant within-region variation as well. And so, for example, if we take that map I showed for men, for the first measure, so our degree to which childhood circumstances impact adult outcomes, we can see, yes, a broad north-south pattern, but also areas where we have neighboring local authorities with very different outcomes. So look at that middle one, that's Buckinghamshire and Oxfordshire. Buckinghamshire in the bottom, 20% local authorities, Oxfordshire in the top. They're neighboring, those differences are large, okay? Similarly, you can go down and look at Cornwall and Devon, neighboring local authorities, large differences. We can look at Herefordshire, Worcestershire, those comparisons, just highlighting a few, okay? So why is that interesting? Well, when we're thinking about what's driving this geographical variation in inequality and opportunity, this is not just about regional factors, north-south level factors. This is also about very local drivers and therefore translating into localized approaches to fixing this. Now, another result I wanted to highlight is actually surprisingly poor results for big regional cities outside of London. So if we take the top 10 biggest cities outside of London in England, then those are in the bottom 20% of local authorities for outcomes of those who grew up in disadvantaged areas. Okay, most of those cities are. So for women and men, these include Bradford, Newcastle, Sheffield, and Nottingham. For men, they also include Leeds, Liverpool, Manchester, and Portsmouth and Bristol for women. Okay? So this isn't just compared to, say, southern areas. This is within the same region. So if we compare those from disadvantaged neighborhoods in inner city local authorities of these cities to those living further out in more rural parts of these regions, they're going to be doing worse. Now, what's driving this? This is surprising. We would generally think that opportunities in cities are better. What's driving this? Well, that's future work, but one of our hypotheses is education is playing a role here, and we will talk more about education throughout the day. We see very similar patterns in earnings as we do in education. So performance on GCSEs among these cohorts was worse in these cities than in the surrounding areas. Okay, so that suggests a potential mechanism to explore. Now, finally, we have these two measures. I mentioned that they're complementary. What happens when we bring them together? What do we learn? What we learn is that places with greater inequality of opportunity, so that's that first measure, are also places where earnings of those from disadvantaged neighborhoods are lower. That's not a given. Sounds intuitive, it's not a given. So where do we go? What does that tell us? Coming back to the motivation for this analysis, suggests that tackling geographic inequalities likely requires addressing this inequality of opportunity, so this intergenerational transmission channel. So improving local opportunities to overcome childhood family disadvantage. But I want to finish on complexity, as always. And so I am going to highlight that this correlation is actually moderate. There are a lot of exceptions, and these are important exceptions. So let's go back to the regional cities that I highlighted. Yes, those from disadvantaged backgrounds do worse there, but so do those from more advantaged backgrounds. So there, the issue is that everybody is doing worse than in other places, rather than that those specifically from disadvantaged backgrounds are doing worse. So that's not an inequality of opportunity story. This is about these broader conditions. In contrast, we also have places where we have high inequality of opportunity, but we also have good outcomes for those from disadvantaged backgrounds. Why? Because everybody in those areas is just doing better than in other places. So these are local authorities in Greater London and in the southeast predominantly. These are places where we probably worry less about inequality of opportunity. With these important caveats in mind, though, the overall takeaway is that tackling inequality of opportunity is likely to be an important part of policy to tackle geographical inequalities. So we need to understand what these opportunities are, and I think the next three presentations are going to speak to that. So I'm going to hand over to Xiaowei.
Thanks, Sonia. So my paper for this symposium looks at youth migration and how that both responds to and reinforces geographical inequalities. Why do we want to study migration? Well, one reason is that in the UK and elsewhere, there's been lots of studies showing that differences in the level of skills across places are an important driver of differences in economic outcomes. For example, in my chapter for the Deaton Review of Inequalities with Henry Overman, we found that in a statistical sense, 90% of the spatial variation in average wages across places can be accounted for by differences in the types of individuals who live in different places. So high-skilled workers are concentrated in particular places, and they tend to live in places that pay higher wages for a given type of person, which then magnifies their individual advantages. When it comes to thinking about policy, though, it really matters to understand what drives these differences in skills across places. So a common response is that to improve economic outcomes in deprived places, we need to improve skills by focusing on education quality and skills provision. And that would make sense if these differences in skills across places reflected differences in local educational attainment. If, on the other hand, migration after obtaining education plays a big role in driving these skills differences, then that calls for a more demand-side approach of trying to encourage job creation in deprived places. Now, another reason we might care about migration is that, as Sonia alluded to, migration can be an important way for people to improve their labour market outcomes, and so differences in the ability or willingness to migrate across people from different places or from different socioeconomic backgrounds can be an important source of these individual level inequalities. In this paper, I focus on the first of these questions, the link between migration and regional inequalities, but it's worth bearing in mind the link to individual level inequalities as I go along, and Peter will come back to this in his talk on parental wealth. So in this paper, I use the same linked administrative education and tax data that Sonia uses, and I look at migration across local labour markets defined as travel to work areas. I focus on people who are in work, and I look at the two oldest cohorts in this data set, so people born in 1986 and 1987. And I look at migration at two stages of their lives. At the very start of their careers, looking at where they moved to by age 27, and then at a slightly later stage when lots of people are starting to settle down, have children, so their migration patterns between age 27 and age 32. To measure local opportunities across places, I'm using a measure of the local earnings premium, which is how much a given individual can expect to earn in one place compared to another. And I'm estimating this by following individuals over time and looking at how their wages change as they move from firm to firm. Okay, so I find that overall, young workers in England are very mobile at the start of their lives. So by age 27, over 1 in 5 workers live outside their area of origin, and by age 32, this increases to 30%. Mobility is particularly high for graduates. for whom by age 32, 45% live outside their area of origin. And when we look at migration patterns at the start of people's careers, there's a very clear pattern of graduates moving away from places with low opportunities towards places offering better economic prospects. So here I'm plotting net migration rates on the vertical axis, separately for non-graduates and graduates, against the local earnings premium. And you see that there's a clear positive correlation for graduates, not so for non-graduates. So if you look at the graduates chart, that big dot on the top right is London. There, an individual can expect to earn 13% higher than the average travel to work area. And the net migration rate of 0.5 indicates that the number of graduates who live in London at age 27 is 50% higher than the number of kids in the same cohort who grew up in London who go on to get degrees. On the bottom left, the point I've drawn out is Bridlington, which is a town on the coast of Yorkshire. Their expected earnings are 5% less than the national average, and the net migration rate of negative 0.5 indicates that the number of graduates at age 27 is half the number of graduates that Bridlington itself produces. So this pattern of high-skilled people moving to places offering better opportunities holds more generally moving beyond the graduate-non-graduate distinction. So here I'm taking kids who grew up outside London and plotting the share who live outside their area of origin at age 27 by their GCSE attainment as a measure of their skills. And you see that there's a clear positive correlation. So when we look at people in the top fifth of their GCSE cohort, 45% live outside their hometown at age 27, compared to around 15% at the bottom of the GCSE distribution. When we do this for kids who grew up in London, however, there's no correlation at all between education attainment and the propensity to move away, which indicates that it's not that high achievers in general are more inclined to leave, but rather that they're going out to seek economic opportunities. So not only are high achievers more likely to move away, they're also more likely to move to better labour markets. So here I'm taking movers who come from outside London and showing the share who move to London in blue, and generally to a place that has higher pay than their area of origin, so has higher local earnings premiums. And you see that at the top of the scale, for people in the top fifth of their GCSE cohort, a third of movers go to London and 70% move to places with better economic opportunities. Okay, so far I've looked at migration up to age 27, but it's possible that as people start to settle down, the way they move can undo some of the sorting patterns you see in earlier moves. And indeed, it might be a good thing for deprived places if young people leave early on, gain skills and experience in the city, and then bring those skills back home. And indeed, when we look at migration between age 27 and 32, we do see that a lot of people still move at these ages, and that the nature of these moves change. So in general, it's not the case that high-skilled people move towards high-paying places or cities, and net migration to London is close to zero. In particular, a third of people who move to London by age 27 then leave the capital by age 32. However, it's not the case that moves in the slightly later stage of life undo the sorting from earlier moves, and there are three reasons for this. One is that many high-skilled people are still moving for the first time after age 27, and if you look at the pattern of their moves, they look very similar to the 16 to 27 moves I showed earlier. The second reason is that whilst a lot of people do go back to their hometowns, it tends to be the lower skilled people who move back. And the third reason is that whilst lots of people are leaving London at this later stage, people who move to London and then move away are mostly moving to the home counties just surrounding London rather than moving back home. And so that third point is shown in the maps here, where on the left-hand side, I'm looking at the origins of people who move to London by age 27, and on the right-hand side, I'm taking people from this group who then leave London by age 32, ensuring where they're moved to. So the values here are location quotients, where a value of 1 indicates that a place has as many movers as you'd expect if movers were randomly distributed. A value of 2 indicates that it has twice as many movers, and so on. And I think what's really striking here is that London draws in movers from all over the country, really, and then redistributes them into the southeast. So in this way, London is fundamentally changing the distribution of skills around the country. Now, that's not the case if we look at other regional cities, so for example, Manchester and Leeds, which tend to draw people in from surrounding areas, and people move back into surrounding areas in their early 30s. So when we look up to age 32, we see that the key beneficiaries of migration patterns in England are London, where skilled people move early on, and then the home counties, where people leaving London later on move into. So in most of the analysis in the paper, I focus on the 2 oldest cohorts in the LEO data, for whom we have information up to their early 30s. But it's also interesting to think about how geographical mobility has changed over time. In this chart, I'm plotting the probability of living outside someone's hometown for different birth cohorts on the horizontal axis, controlling for the rich set of observables that you see in the LEO data, like the place of origin, single year of age, different types of demographics. And what we see is that in recent years, young workers, and especially graduates, have become much more mobile. So graduates born in 1997 are 8 percentage points more likely than otherwise similar graduates who were born in 1986. We also see that, not in this chart, that the increase in migration rates has been steeper, at least until the last year or so, for people who come from lower paying places. So all this suggests that migration could be playing an increasing role in widening geographical inequalities. Okay, so in summary, what I find in this paper is that a large part of the geographical inequalities in skills that we see across the country stems from migration patterns in adulthood rather than differences in local educational attainment. So there are obviously differences in local educational attainment, as Sonia's paper shows, but that's not the whole story. And indeed, youth mobility has increased in recent cohorts, suggesting that migration might be playing a bigger role in driving regional inequalities. I think what this implies is that raising educational attainment in deprived places alone will not be enough to boost local economic outcomes. Without improvements in local jobs, high-skilled people will continue to leave, and those who are not able or not willing to leave won't be making full use of their skills. History, I think, also tells us that we can't count on improvements in education alone to lead to high-skilled jobs being created in an area. So we can't count on that leading to high-skilled firms moving to the area or starting up in the area. And Philip's talk on capital markets will touch on one of the mechanisms behind this. Over the decades, what we've seen is that there's been a big increase in graduate shares all across the country, but outside London, the number of graduate jobs has failed to keep up with the increase in graduate shares, leading to an increasing share of graduates working in non-graduate jobs and a decline in the graduate wage premium across the country. And so what this points to is that to improve economic performance in left-behind places, we really need a coordinated approach at the local level, targeting both the supply side, so policies to improve education attainment, as well as the demand side, targeting job creation. Thank you. Hand over to Peter.
Okay, so I'm a bit of a cuckoo in the nest in the sense that this paper, it's a working paper that I co-wrote with David Stark. It's not part of the Fiscal Studies special issue, but it's very related to the papers we've just seen. I'll start off with a compulsory data acknowledgement and disclaimer. So we'll be using data from the ONS longitudinal study, which I'll describe, and we're very grateful for the support we will have in getting access to and in using that data. So what the previous presentations have shown is that mobility is important for understanding opportunity, inequalities and opportunity. And of course, one barrier to entry into gaining access to these prosperous labor markets, as the kind of Shalway was talking about, places where you'll get a high local wage premium just for being in those particular areas, is that they have high housing costs. And the source of inequality and opportunity is the differences in parental resources that arise when you have big house price booms, which redistribute resources effectively between households depending on when and where they bought their homes. So some people will get a big windfall, and other people will see rising house prices without seeing those same windfalls. And these are both things that are going to be worsened at a time when you have very rapid and very geographically uneven house price increases. So in our paper, what we wanted to look at is we wanted to look back in history at this big house price boom that occurred in the late 1990s and the early 2000s, affecting many of the cohorts we've been discussing today, and talk about how that affected social mobility among the people that grew up in that generation. So firstly, on this point of kind of uneven and rapid house price increases, so this shows the house price to annual household earnings ratio nationally and also in different areas. And you can see this big increase in house price to earning ratios in the UK as a whole. These more than doubled over the period we're talking about, so the mid-1990s to the just before the great financial crisis. And this was very different across areas. So in London, so these are average earnings in London, so this is reflecting the differences in average earnings across areas. In London, that increase went, from where are we? From about 4 to 14, 15. Whereas in the northeast, that increase was far less dramatic. So there's both a very large increase in property prices relative to incomes, and also these being very uneven across places. So the questions we're asking is, did this created enormous differences in parents' housing wealth? So did these differences in parents' housing wealth shape young people's opportunities, how much wealth they had, whether they bought their homes, where they're located, and how well they do in the labor market? And more fundamentally, we're trying to answer a causal question. So we want to understand what the causal role of parents' housing wealth is, independent of other factors. And that's important because, obviously, the way you treat wealth in the tax system or whether you have property booms in the first place, we want to understand if those things are independently driving these outcomes rather than this just being a correlation that's related to other factors. So the data we're using some historical data. So data on individuals in England and Wales from different censuses, from the 1971 censuses onwards, so the census is held every 10 years. They've been linked together through the ONS longitudinal study. So far, these are kind of made available to researchers with a bit of a lag. So far, we've been using data up to and including the 2011 census. The 2021 census has now been added, and we hope to update our results with the 2021 census. But so far, we're only going up to 2011. And what this data set allows us to do is we can see the records of individuals who've been linked across censuses. So we can see them when they were children. We can see them when they're children. We can see who they're living with, so who their parents are, what they're doing, whether they own their homes. And then we can track them over time and can see what happens to them as they grow up and leave home and enter the labor market into different sorts of jobs. So what we can do is we can use this to compare children who grew up in that boom period, that house price boom period. So for us, these are going to be children who were born 1974 to 1983, because then we can see them in childhood just before the start of the boom. So we can compare them with each other in 2011, depending on where the parents were living and whether they owned or rented. And we can also compare them with a previous birth cohort who grew up at a period when house prices were not rising as fast. So these people are going to be 8 to 7 in the 91 census, and by the time we're looking at the 2011 census, they'll be between 28 and 37. So the census, long source of frustration, doesn't ask about people's incomes or earnings. So we're going to work these out based on the jobs they have, which industries, occupations, and region they're in. And it also doesn't ask about the value of homes, but we know very precisely we know quite precisely where they live, the type of home they have, so we can make a good guess at the value of their home. So the challenge for us is, so we could take a simpler approach, which is just look at the outcomes of children with parents who have more or less housing wealth. And that would probably confirm what we found in lots of previous research, that children from wealthier backgrounds, they do better, they live healthier lives, they have higher incomes, they have more wealth themselves. But these things are identifying correlations. We want to understand the kind of causal role that their parents' housing wealth plays. And this is challenging because young adults' outcomes are going to be correlated with many things that are related to the parents' housing wealth. So the local house prices they face, how well the local economy is doing, are they in a boom economy or not? The child's preferences that might be correlated with the parents' preferences, and so on. Skill transmission, other things. So we want to make sure that when we see the children of wealthier parents and wealthier themselves, does this reflect the parents' resources or these other things? Ideally, we would kind of take people, we would randomly allocate housing wealth to some people and others and see how well they do. That would be very expensive. We don't have the research budget for that. So we take a different approach. So the approach we take is to take some outcome, say home ownership rates when the kids have grown up. We'll look at the gap between those outcomes for owners and renters. And we're going to look if that gap grows larger during this boom period, and it grows larger between areas that do well in the boom period compared to, in terms of house price growth, compared to other areas. And if we see that's the case, we will attribute these gains to the housing wealth itself. So it's not the differences across areas, because we're looking at differences across people within those areas. It's not difference between owners and renters, because we're looking at these differences across areas. And so we're attributing it to housing wealth. We can also put this in a kind of regression setting where we control for other aspects of the parents' background, their occupation, education, and other things. But it's perhaps easiest to kind of show graphically, so what we're doing. So what this graph shows is, it says home ownership, it's housing wealth. So housing wealth on the y-axis, and you can see that for the children of parents who own and parents who rent. And you've got that for this pre-boom cohort of children, so they grew up when house prices weren't going up very fast, and the post-boom, where these are children who grew up in this period of rapid house price growth. And on the x-axis, you've got how quickly house prices were going up in that boom period. So as you go to the right, those are areas that saw really rapid house price increases, and on the left, there's places that didn't see such high house price increases. And what you can see, if you look at the pre-boom cohort, you can see, so the children of owners do better than the children of renters. The children in areas who grew up in areas which would be prosperous in the 90s, 2000s house price boom, they do better than other kids. But that gap doesn't really change according to which area you grew up in. What you can see by contrast when you look at the post-boom cohort is this gap getting much stronger. So as you look at people who grew up in these areas of fastest house price growth, the gap between owners and renters in those areas is much bigger than areas with lower house price growth. So from this, we'd say that the parents' housing wealth causally led to children having higher house price growth. So this is home ownership. So this is a graph showing the same thing, but for home ownership as the outcome. You can see the same thing, so not much change in the gap in the pre-boom period, but also not much change in the gap across areas in the post-boom period. So what we're finding is actually, parents' housing wealth didn't lead to children being more likely to become homeowners. Conditioned to become homeowners, they would own more valuable homes. So all this holds, so I've drawn this kind of in a simple graphical way, but these hold up in a more complete regression analysis. And so to put some numbers on this, so having parents who had £100,000 more gross housing wealth as a result of the house price boom led to £15,000 more in gross housing wealth for these kids when they're adults, but no effect on home ownership rates. And so they're just as likely to buy, but they're buying more valuable homes. So what accounts for this? So a key reason we think is where people are buying when they buy, and this is why it ties into the work on mobility that Xiaowei was talking about. So what this chart shows you, these are regression coefficients. So this is the impact of £100,000 of housing wealth on three different things. So being in a particular region, moving in a particular region if you started from outside it, and owning in a region. And what you can see is that, so parents' housing wealth means you're less likely to be in the places at the top. You're more likely to be in London and the southeast, and you're in particular more likely to own in London and the southeast. So these bars aren't, maybe you can't see them at the back, but the grey bar shows that yes, so people. I'm not supposed to move away from the microphone in case people can't hear me online. So you can see people being more likely to own in London and the rest of the southeast. So what we're finding is that parent housing wealth helps children gain access to these prosperous places in London and the southeast. Also means they're less likely to leave those places if they grew up there. So a question we can ask is, did this, along with maybe other factors, advantages that might be conferred by parents' housing wealth, does that translate into greater success in the labour market and higher wages? So as I said, so while earnings aren't asked about in the census, what we do know is the type of jobs people can have. And so we can look at the kind of jobs they have and ask if it's a high-paying job or a low-paying job. So we think, if it's a finance job in London, you're probably paid quite well. And so we can use that information from other sources. So this is again, these are regression coefficients. So this is the effect of parents' housing wealth on the probability of being in different earnings quantiles. And we've done this separately for men and women. So if we start by looking at the men, who are the blue bars, what you can see is they're less likely to be in these middle-paying occupations, in the middle of the earnings distribution. They're more likely to be in the top 20%, and in particularly more likely to be in the top 10% and top 5%. So it seems that if your parents did well in the housing boom, you're more likely to access these really high-paying jobs if you're a man. By contrast, so for women, so those are shown in the red bars, we don't see the same effect. So the impact of parental housing wealth on women labour market performance as measured by wages isn't as great as that we find for men. So just to summarize, so what we find is that the children of parents who benefit from the housing boom, they're more likely to have greater property wealth themselves, more likely to buy homes, particularly in London and also the southeast, and for men, they're more likely to enter the highest paying occupations. So what we find is, so causally, property wealth gains among parents confer advantages to their offspring, with the implication that things that affect housing wealth gains we think would affect social mobility. So things like how we tax housing wealth gains, but also why these booms occur in the first place. So in these constrained markets, do housing supply constraints in booming areas push up house prices in those areas? That would also have consequences for social mobility. So I'm done now, so I'll hand over to Philip for the final talk in this session.
I'll stand there and then maybe you two can sit here, we'll swap around. Do you want to come up here, Tom? If you both come up here, it'll be easier to switch around. So we're going to go in the order. I'm going to go first, then Michiel and Colin. And the reason is this is completely a team effort. We've been working on this stuff for years. We have two other co-authors as well on some of our other papers. So this is a team effort of 5 people for 7 years. So we're just doing a very short snippets in terms of the paper in the Fiscal Studies Journal. We're very grateful to the symposium organisers today and also for the journal as well that we were able to contribute to this. So we'll just run through very quickly. So the start of this, okay. We have an incredible data set that no academics in the world have. Okay, it's extremely expensive and it's completely confidential. What we have is we have the data set of all the largest real estate investments in the US, across Europe and the UK. Everything over $10 million US. We know everything about the transaction. The building, where it is, we know the employment, we know the value of the transaction, when it took place, we know about the credit ratings of the building, the credit background of the financiers, we know everything. and the price paid for everything, and on the basis of that, we've spent many years and we've worked out how to calculate the risk premia of every individual investment. Then we set it in the context of all the OECD data on cities and regions using the metro data. And then we can use a series of econometric tools which are standard in the literature but applied in the context of these investments to give us a measure of how investors think about the risk associated with each city on a year-by-year basis, actually on a daily basis. And that's not been done before anywhere. We published a paper already on the US, that was our first paper, and we have a series of papers, some of which are published on our institute. We're funded by the Productivity Institute, ESRC. So the background to this is that these investments are not mum and dad real estate investors. If you've got a bit of extra equity, recycle, buy a house and then rent it out to your student kids' friends. These are enormous, in some cases, investments at a place. So they vary between 10 million, many of them are hundreds of millions, and some of them are billions. They're all commercial. It's not about housing. It's about building science parks, buying office blocks, building big industrial sites. And they're not speculative. They're all in the secondary market. So it's not speculative about what might happen in the future. They know exactly everything about each investment. It's all in the secondary market. So this is how we work. And with these data, what we can show are two things. In the pre-crisis period before 2008, the way the investors worked was almost exactly in a textbook model. You often hear people say, well, there was too much money sloshing around in the pre-crisis period. People were just throwing money at everything. It was a bubble. It's not true. We can show it's not true. It was not true in the US, in the UK, and Europe. What was happening was investors were using their portfolio knowledge. That's precisely what they're paid to do, using all the techniques. And they were basically pricing things, at least in a textbook sense, correctly. And so the distributions, and what we do is we plot these distributions. This is in the UK, but we've done this for the US as well. It's all published. We can just send anyone links to the other papers if anyone's interested. What we do is we model this at the standard city region, which is the standard urban economics approach, but it's not as accurate as modelling it at the individual cluster level. So London is a series of clusters, and you model the composition of Londoners according to all these probability distributions of many clusters inside London, and you do all the analysis at that level because we have it not just at block level, we have it at building level. And when you do it the more finely grained, what you get are much more precise estimates. So basically we model things at the city level, but also at the cluster level. And that's important because many cities internally are completely different to each other, how they're structured. And how the investors, you think about location, that's how investors think, location, that's completely true. One end of a street to another one could be a massive difference in pricing, but also perceived risk. And that's what we do. So this is how we do it. So we report both cities and clusters, but focus on the clusters, it tells you much more detail. So basically what happened was pre-crisis, things worked according to a textbook model. Post-crisis, what happens is investors suddenly don't know what to do because you go from a world of risk to uncertainty. They can't put probability distributions on anything. And what do? You panic. And we've talked to a lot of very senior institutional investors on both sides of the Atlantic and across Europe, and they all give us exactly the same response. Suddenly no one knows what to do. So you go from finely tuned portfolio theory to pure heuristics, rules of thumb. And you basically are trying to preserve value. And what you get is what we argue in our papers, and in this particular paper, you get a shock effect, which is a flight to safety. Why were people pouring into Japanese government bonds immediately after the crisis? They knew Japan hadn't grown for 20 years. It's about safety. Why is gold, people pouring into gold, fine art? It's all about safety. And investors had exactly the same response. But the way this works out is geographical. It's got nothing to do with expected growth because that's not what the issue is. The issue is trying to preserve your anchor investments as much as possible. And what you do is the shock effect, the investment flows pour into very particular places, particular types of cities and regions, but also particular places within those cities and regions, and we can plot all of this. In the US case, that shock effect, the flight to capital, went to about 25, 26, 27 cities, not Detroit. It was all the biggest cities because you've got the relationship between city size and productivity is almost a straight line in the US when you log. It's not in the UK. You've got all these discontinuities because of the underperformance of the second-tier cities, what you're referring to. In the UK case, the shock effect, so you can see the investment behaviour post-crisis, it's almost orthogonal to what a textbook would tell you, because the investors don't know what they're doing. You talk to them, they'll tell you privately, nobody had any idea what to do. So you panic and you go for rules of thumb. And the effect in the UK was that money, basically, the UK pre-crisis was primarily blue chip. Post-crisis, you get a surge of inflows of capital into London, and most of the UK is shocked into quite literally junk bond territory, and most of the UK is still there. London goes immediately back to blue chip because you have a surge of capital moving in. London is awash with capital, and this is the greater metro area of London in terms of the OECD definition. So it includes Reading, Guildford, Oxford, Cambridge. It goes that far out. A surge of capital in which starts pushing up land prices very quickly. There's a huge availability of credit, so the price of capital is collapsing. The banks are desperate to offload money onto you as long as it's in that area, whereas the rest of the country, you can't get capital, and any residual capital is being priced at exorbitant levels. You see exactly the same relationship between Boston in the US and Akron, Ohio. It's exactly the same problem. So what you get is a divergence in terms of risk pricing. And that transmits through what we call the collateral channel to all the liquidity pricing of those places. So if you had a real estate equity pre-crisis in Guildford, for example, suddenly your quid's in because there's a surfeit of capital. The banks are desperate to loan at incredibly low prices. So your leveraging position, what's called the collateral channel, has just gone up, which speaks directly to Peter's comments a few minutes ago. Whereas if you're in, say, Bolton, the opposite have happened. You have a business which you've got some sort of loan funding on the business which is secured on your real estate equity. Overnight, you've gone from black to red. Nothing has changed in terms of productivity, but suddenly your balance sheet has shifted dramatically, and this is what we argue has been happening. So what you get is you get a partitioning in terms of how the capital markets price things. So today in the UK, the partitioning starts after between London and the rest of the UK. That partitioning is around 200 plus basis points. But interesting, when you look at, these are the risk premium, these are the risk premium, these are the yields. They're two different measures of risk, and investors use both of them because this is what they use to benchmark against gilts, for example, or sovereign bonds. But interesting, what you see is post-crisis, London goes back. This is not here. This is when QE is coming in, and London follows QE. These are the official sovereign rates, almost exactly right up to the middle of 2016. The fall in London risk premium in the private capital markets mirrors almost exactly the official yield rates due to QE, so it's doing its job, but it stops with the Brexit vote. Because investors won't price London even more favourably. That trend, so in a sense, QE has stopped working in London. But for 10 years, for 7 years, it's worked. Whereas for the rest of the country, what you see, again, if I try to do this, the rest of the country, there's no effect at all. QE had no effect outside of the London region. But more importantly, where is that shock effect biggest? It's in the city centres. And again, this relates to something that Sonia was talking about earlier. The city centres, the Manchesters and Newcastles, actually what we see in terms of the risk pricing, that's exactly what happened. The places that bore the brunt of this shock effect are the centres of the big urban areas outside of the southeast of England. So those risk spreads today, so you can see the yield rates, I can't get through it. The yield rates basically had no effect on the rest of the country, none at all. And those spreads today between the city centres are about 300 basis points, which is the same as today's spreads between the gilts of the UK sovereign bonds, and those are being issued today by places like Romania and Chile. So that's the kind of what's happened to the capital markets in the UK. That is how the investors perceive the UK, that effectively it's two different countries. But that's since 2008. It hasn't narrowed. It is quite literally another country. We extend the argument to the rest of Europe, and we look at the UK comparisons. It's not working very well.
Thank you. Yeah, so we can add in risk pricing for continental Europe to get a bit of a closer sense of the extent to which these spreads signal relative strength or relative weakness of different parts of the UK urban system. So let's start with the graph in the upper left part of the slide here. So what we see there, in yellow we see a line for the UK and the grey line is for continental Europe. And what we see is that prior to the great financial crisis, the UK has a serious advantage in terms of risk pricing relative to continental Europe. But it disappears with the crisis, and it starts to track pretty closely between these two areas. Now, if we move on to the graph in the upper right corner, what we see is that the initial graph we were looking at actually masks these UK internal difference between regions. So what we see now is that pre-crisis, both London but also all the other UK cities had a risk pricing advantage compared to continental Europe. But after the crisis, what we see is that London continues to hold most of the time this advantage. But the other UK cities are most of the time at a disadvantage, so in a relatively systematic way. Now, if we move on to the bottom left graph, what we see there is the central business districts, and, well, we see these serious spreads, as Philip just referred to already. And what we see as well is that when we focus on the 2016 onward period, is that, well, what we've had is that the great financial crisis shocked the country, and, well, Brexit, or the vote really, overlaid that shock and accentuated it. So we see the spreads widen there internally in the UK, but compared to continental Europe, we see some narrowing there. So we see that the advantage of London is being arbitraged away, and we see a growing disadvantage of all the places outside of London within the UK compared to their European counterparts. And this is not as much of an issue outside of the CBDs, although we do see that London, both in its city centre as well as for the city overall, tends to have this risk pricing advantage. Now we can do the same graphs looking at yields, so the expected returns on these real estate investments. So the risk premia are over and above the sovereign yields. And, well, obviously there's a bit of variation in those sovereign yields across Europe. But this gives us pretty much the same picture, perhaps a bit more clearly so, of these very same patterns. And so in particular in panel C, we do see that these disadvantages in UK city centres outside of London, well, it's clearly a disadvantage relative to continental European city centres. So when you're asking, well, is it a relative strength of London or a relative weakness elsewhere? When we were looking at these spreads earlier on, well, this gives you a bit more of an idea of the relative performance compared to places elsewhere.
Sorry to drop you for 2 more minutes.
Okay, good. I'll be quick then. So we mapped a few things as well. So here we're looking at risk premia post-2016, the averages until a few months ago. And so we see this partitioning between London and the rest of the country quite strongly. The same when we look at yields. So that gives you a sense of the differences in, well, the cost of attracting capital. And we've done some work at the Institute which tells us that the shocks in the UK and the spreads there have been larger than elsewhere in Europe. But we're right now trying to work out in much more detail all the differences there, but I would like to hand over to Colin.
Okay, so this is the third and final part of this trilogy. and I'm going to try and interpret these striking results that Philip and Michael have just presented in terms of its implications for the debate that we're having and for policy formulation. And let me just emphasize that these are really striking variations that are being reported in terms of the risk margins and the cost of capital between London and the southeast and the rest of the country. It's the sort of market segmentation that one associates with what happens across countries with very different tax systems, regulatory systems, and macroeconomic conditions. But this is not across countries. This is within a country with the same tax system, same regulations, same macroeconomic conditions. And what underpins this is the nature of the financial sector and the financial infrastructure that we've got in Britain. One of the things that we really know is important in finance is location. It matters where an investor sits or lives in relation to where the borrower is. That even with technology and financialization and AI, the co-location of investors to borrower firms is critically important because there are two types of information. The first is the type of information that's associated with big data, namely codified generic information. The second type of information is specific, tacit, to the particular borrower and to the locality. And looking someone in the eye and knowing can one really trust that person and their business model is critically important. In that regard, Britain is two countries. The North is another country. The market segmentation is pronounced as if across countries, comparing, for example, the UK with Romania. Now, what we also know is that the most successful periods in the development of the UK have been associated with exactly the opposite type of financial conditions. The UK led the world in the Industrial Revolution and became the workshop of the world largely because of local banks financing SMEs. In the beginning of the 21st century, we had the most iconic companies in the world, such as Cadbury, Boots, Beecham, etc., which all became major international companies because of local stock markets situated all over the country. By the middle of the 20th century, both the local banks and the local stock markets had disappeared. We had 5 clearing banks headquartered in London and 1 stock market in London. And as a consequence of that, the rest of the UK became cut off from the capital markets in London. And this just illustrates the extent to which the rest of the UK is, in a sense, a financial desert. It shows the concentration of business angels in London and South East, where 50% of business angels are in London and the South East, and as you can see from this graph, virtually nothing elsewhere apart from in Scotland. And in terms of investment equity deals, 50% of equity deals happen in London and the South East by their number, 70% by value. And this isn't just a demand for finance problem. What is particularly striking is if you look at the availability of VC businesses in funding high-growth companies, not only has London got an immense advantage, it's actually increased its advantage over the rest of the UK. This is a problem that's getting worse, not better. I'm going to bring it to a close now by just drawing the policy implications out of this. What this implies is that the location of finance matters And what is critically important to address the UK's regional inequality problems is to create regional financial hubs. But they don't just create hubs of financial institutions. It's equally important to have the infrastructure and the ecosystem of professional service firms such as lawyers, accountants, and consultants in those places as well. And associated with that is the education that's required to develop entrepreneurs, the educational institutions, but also the business angels, the mentors, and the people who can network those who are trying to start up and grow businesses. This needs to be a focus of national and local policy to create businesses and to create businesses across the UK, and our one and only example of a development bank in the UK, the British Business Bank, should be playing a key role in developing these financial hubs across Britain, which it simply failed to do to date. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you. So I'm going to invite my panellists back up to the stage, and then I guess one of the trio you can choose which one you want to stay. Thank you. Okay, so we have 20 minutes for questions. I'll take a cluster of questions at the same time so we can ask them in order. So hands up, and if you can say who you are, that would be lovely. Thank you. Have we got a roving mic, Rory? Yeah. So there's two. We'll start down here. Thank you. We'll start here and then go to Alex. Thank you.
Paul Swinney from the Data City. Great analysis, Philip. We've talked about before. Very interesting. I felt it was a bit of a leap, though, between the analysis and then the policy recommendations about it being lack of access to capital. Could you say a little bit more about that? Because the flip side of that could be that there's actually an issue of just lack of companies. And then I think we've probably talked before, in the US, the distances we're talking about in terms of how far capital goes to invest is much larger than the distance between, say, London and Greater Manchester or London and Glasgow. Could you say a little bit more about that? That would be fab.
Right, I'll take some questions at once. So it's Alex. I think Victor's coming that way. Thank you.
Hi, Alex Beer, Nuffield Foundation. So this is a question for Sonia, Xiaowei and Peter. And it'd be great if you could all discuss sort of the gender differences that you discovered. I mean, in particular, Peter, those sort of charts you displayed at the end about how that sort of parental wealth didn't seem to sort of track to sort of differences in outcomes for women. And I know, Xiaowei, you didn't address it directly, but I'm sure you might have looked at the sort of gender differences within your results. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Alex. Any other questions for now? No, okay, let's start. Let's start with the last of those then, because it's all to all three of you. Gender differences. Who wants to start?
Happy to start. I'm glad you brought that up because I sort of couldn't fit that in, but I think one of our stark findings is that the places that are better for men are not necessarily the places that are better for women. Really stark example is actually inner London, which I didn't get to. London on the whole is performing really well. But when we look at boys from disadvantaged neighbourhoods in London, they're doing among the worst in the country in terms of earnings. When we look at girls, they're doing among the best. So I think there's a lot to unpack as to why that's happening. There's some life cycle effects, fertility, correlation with fertility, timing with background and education, but it does definitely point to the fact that the sort of local characteristics that are important for success of boys and girls might be different in very important ways. And so understanding these patterns separately, rather than the inclination to say, oh, it's a bit hard to understand women's earnings, so let's focus on men, which has been historically the direction in this literature, that seems like something to really highlight.
I'll go next. I think I probably have the least interesting things to say on gender. So when I look at differences in both local wage premiums and sort of patterns of migration, so the correlation between net migration and local wage premiums by gender, on aggregate, these look pretty much the same. So it doesn't look like there are differences in either mobility levels or the way in which people migrate by gender. There are differences, however, when you dig down into specific groups. So, for example, women of Pakistani and Bangladeshi origin are much less likely to move away than either men from that group or women more generally. And so I think when we think about the link between migration and individual opportunities, that's one way in which gender differences or the interaction between gender and ethnic differences play out, so people less likely to move out to places with better opportunities.
Yes, I think it's really interesting, and I think it's only made stark when we see all the presentations together, actually, to see, that not only the local characteristics matter differently by gender, but also this kind of parental wealth differently by gender. And for us, it's something we need to explore more. I mean, one can speculate, so one hypothesis might be that labour market success isn't just about earnings, it's also about having a job which is fulfilling, has good, non-wage characteristics, and maybe those kind of advantages are channeled into those kind of things rather than into kind of raw earnings. It's speculation, but it's something we need to explore a bit more.
Thank you. Philip, Paul's question was really about kind of how are we sure that it's an access to capital problem as a kind of a lack of good ideas problem, which I think relates to some of the other work on if people are moving out of that area, are there good opportunities for investments in those areas? So what makes you confident that it's a lack of access to capital story as opposed to a lack of good ideas story?
Because it was so sudden. Nothing changed overnight. Suddenly the industrial structure of the country didn't change. Suddenly zillions of businesses suddenly didn't disappear. We had the same question actually from people in the Bank of England, including the Monetary Policy Committee, who've helped us a lot, by the way. Well, is it because investors' expectations have shifted? Okay, tell me what they shifted about. Was there suddenly a massive shock where the economy overnight changed? No. It was the capital markets that changed, not their knowledge of the economy as such in terms of what businesses were out there and stuff. That didn't change. What happened was a massive shock. In terms of the geography question, your point is correct. Of course, the US cities, apart from Philadelphia, Washington, Baltimore, the US cities all have enormous hinterlands. And even Boston to New York's 200 miles. So the cities have their own hinterland. So in terms of economic geography, the US looks completely different to the UK. We're much more like the rest of the European countries, which is why we're also doing European comparisons. What you see in the US happen was the shock effect was to about 25 different cities. So exactly the same safety argument, but not Detroit. They knew what they were doing. You go into big cities, but don't put it there. What happens there is that the partitioning is extremely dramatic, and the spreads and how they partition when you look at the distributions in the US are identical to the UK, almost identical, and the rest of Europe is almost identical. Why? Because those markets are incredibly integrated. The financing is coming from common pools. It's not that there's suddenly a shock in terms of what happened in the UK, it's also in the US and also in Europe. Moreover, the shock effects when you mark out how they actually happened are different in different countries. So the UK is monocentric, which reflects our economic geography. The US is polycentric, but it's only a big city story. That reflects the urban regional structure in the US. Germany is neither. It's polycentric. It's not about big cities. It's all to different cities in Germany. And we can actually, the maps that Michiel shows, we can see that. Switzerland is to multiple cities. The Nordics are to a whole series of different. So the investors do know what they're doing. So it's not about a sudden change in the economy. But what we argue is there are then dramatic changes which are a result of the shock effects, because the endogeneity of the collateral channel, which relates also to what Peter was talking about, that is very profound, because the largest form of collateral for business startups is real estate equity. It goes back to a famous paper in the EJ, Black and Demesre, about 1996. Made exactly that point. That's how most SMEs start. Where does the banking system come in? Because in the US and in Germany, nearly all of that collateral finance is provided by local banks. The US has 5,500 local banks. People don't realize that. It has fallen from about 7, but it's still 5,500. And that is still driving the geography of that business finance. In the UK, there's nothing to step into that vacuum. So it's a very, very dramatic shift. The one exception in the UK that we've done a lot of work with, and we're working with the British Business Bank and the UK National Wealth Fund, we're talking to them all the time. The one exception is the only decentralised bank in the UK, which is Handelsbanken. And Colin's written a lot on that. We have other papers as part of our suite of papers on this. That is the exception. But it's such a small player in the big picture. And so to think about how do you restructure and rebuild a decentralised capital market which builds on genuine local knowledge, is really what the challenge is, and that's where our conversations with the British Business Bank and so on, that's where they sit.
Great, thank you. Other questions? Gentleman at the back, and then one here. Oh, lots no questions now. Okay, we'll work our way forward, and I'll take as a group. Thank you.
Hi, Anthony Breach, Director of Policy and Research at Centre for Cities. This question is for the IFS colleagues. So I think quite a common theme across the pre-presentations was the role of restricted housing supply in shaping the outcomes, both between different regions but also within regions. We also know from a whole bunch of evidence that we have an unusually restrictive planning system by international standards. Do the three papers together imply that the government is right to move ahead on planning reform as part of its economic agenda, but also perhaps that actually it should be pushing even further towards more radical planning reforms, perhaps towards a zoning system if they want to tackle both our growth challenges but also our social inclusion challenges as well? Thank you.
Wonderful, wonderful. Thank you very much. And there was a question, if you put your hands up again. Oh, so just question just in front. Yeah, thanks, Victor. Then I'm going to come down to the lady here. Thanks.
Okay, my name's Trishal Pandya from Centre for Social Justice. I wrote a paper about 18 months ago. It was all about devolving out employment support in this country and also adult education. And our guest at the end from the trio kind of made me think about that, because he was talking about Germany and Scandinavia being polycentric, and actually their devolved structure means they can be that. The Dutch have recently copied that model. It took them a decade, and they went from a position of having lower economic participation and lower employment rate than us, and over a decade they overtook us. So there's something about, if you can get devolved governance right, and you can get the sort of second cities and subordinate cities more competitive. I wonder if our guests have any views on that, because I think it will take time, but it's definitely something worth doing, and you'll see the stock markets and the businesses develop thereafter.
Great, thank you. And then can we come down this way, Victor? Thank you. I'll take two, so I'll do this one, then the one in front of you. Thank you.
Hi all, I'm Elizabeth Gerard from the Learning and Work Institute, and firstly, thank you for the wonderful presentations. I also had a question for IFS colleagues, and particularly the youth mobility research was really compelling, and intuitively what the trends showed us, that initial career move towards London, towards where the earnings are highest, makes a lot of intuitive sense, and that second move outside of London but to surrounding counties also makes a lot of sense. It's tied to the housing market, I would also assume. The cohort that you were looking at, that when they hit 32 was 2019, I think. I was wondering if I could ask you to speculate slightly about the cohorts who might be hitting that career change now or in the post-COVID period. Do you think those trends would stay the same, or are they dispersing further because the housing market in those surrounding counties has only got tighter and the labour markets have only got tighter as well?
Lovely, thank you. I'll take one more from the gentleman in front, and then we'll get some answers. Thank you.
Hello, Kevin Latham from the Sutton Trust. My main question is for Xiaowei, and this is thinking about the youth migration. I wondered if you looked at migration for a university education, and where people are going and whether that affects subsequent earnings, and if you looked at whether it's a Russell Group university, and also how poorer students tend to stay nearer to home. So all of those factors and how that might affect the picture. And then just a curiosity question for the last paper, which I claim a lot of ignorance about, to be perfectly honest, but it's fascinating. How far, I guess my question is how far does the government have the ability to change policy that would address the issues that you're considering, given that presumably a lot of that investment is international investment and tied up in the way that you said the capital markets are all very interrelated around the world. So can setting up local, how does the mechanism work that you set up your local or regional banking infrastructures that international markets and capital investors are going to see and notice?
Lovely, thank you very much. So Pete, let's start with you. And you're not working on housing supply. So the questions basically are: is there a government right to move on housing supply? Should it go even further on planning reforms or zoning?
Well, I think so. There's sort of two ways that these planning would matter for the results. So one is the kind of origin story, so in terms of generating these inequalities in wealth in the first place. That these very uneven house price increases partly occurred because it was difficult to build in those areas where the house prices were going up quickly. And so that part of this kind of, generating wealth for some people and others is a result of the planning system. And then the second stage, so that's the kind of origin, and then the second stage is the sort of destination. Like, do people have access to labour markets that allow them to move to an area where there's a higher premium, and so that they can move up the ladder in social mobility terms. So those are the sort of ways that planning matters. I don't want to comment, with the IFS, not comment on what the government should do, but so that, an implication is it would affect social mobility. But obviously there's lots of trade-offs involved in planning decisions, and we're not commenting on that.
Great, thank you. Sonia, do you want to say anything about devolved governments?
I think, the panel later on, I think we'll be talking about interconnected local approaches to dealing with the kind of geographical inequalities that we see. I think there was a point there about local employment opportunities, the right training opportunities. That links to Xiaowei's point about just doing one thing, like improving education, is going to potentially result in unintended consequences of just the skilled people continuing to move out unless that's connected to stronger labour markets. And that ties to some points I made around, some of these differences are very local. And so really that requires this interconnected approach needs to understand the local context very well. And I know that's something we're going to come back to in the panel later on. So I think that obviously devolved government has that perspective on those local conditions, much more closer and much better informed. So that would suggest there's an important role there.
Great, thanks. Then Xiaowei, the other questions were on the youth mobility stuff. So Elizabeth's question on basically what will happen to the most recent cohorts, and Kevin's question on broadly on the role of universities in these plans.
Yeah, on current cohorts, I don't really know, I think probably part of the increase in youth migration we see in the cohorts in the admin data is a bounce back from the financial crisis. So we know that the cohort born in the late 1980s, those were ones entering the labour market around the time of the financial crisis. And so, maybe as that effect wears off, that accounts for part of the increase in migration. We know that in recent years there's been an increase in kids living at home with their parents. So maybe that results in a decline in migration. And also, I guess, that increases socioeconomic differences in the sense that it's kids who already have parents who live in London or the southeast with access to the London labour market who benefit from that. On migration for uni, I didn't look at that in this particular paper because we don't actually have location data for universities in the publicly available the available data for researchers. I looked at it previously for using DFE data that we used to hold in-house, and I think there we found that the vast majority of people who go to university do move travel to work areas to go to uni, and people who move travel to work areas are then much more likely to not go back to their hometown after university. And sort of thinking about locations, it seems like it's plausible that universities are, an important draw of talent to the local area who then stay behind and work there afterwards. I think that varied quite a lot by specific locations. So London draws in people from all over, regardless of where they study. But there are other places, I think, from memory, places like Leeds and Brighton, where actually a lot of the graduates that they attract are graduates who come there for university and then decide to stay behind. So that could be an important channel. Could I say something on the planning point as well? I think it's sort of interesting because on the one hand, London is by far the centre of activity in this country, and efforts to increase housing supply in London to make London more accessible for different people is likely to increase social mobility. We know that not only are wages in London higher, but these wage differences emerge over time. And so you can think of moving to London as a sort of investment, right? It's something you need to pay a large upfront cost for to reap returns in the future. And like any sort of investment, it's those from better off backgrounds who are able to make that investment. But on the other hand, sort of given the huge concentration of talent and capital, as Philip was saying, in London, like removing planning constraints in London is probably likely to draw more capital and more talent into the city, and so that could sort of entrench the economic geography that we have, right? So it's sort of a model of leaning into the agglomeration effects that we have in London, and allowing more people to access these agglomeration effects. But given the mobility of labour and capital, I wonder if there's a bit of a trade-off between doing that and actively trying to change the spatial equilibrium in the country and try to create agglomeration forces elsewhere.
There's also an issue there, isn't it, about congestion. I mean, the home economies are congested in various ways, and actually at some point there has to be a limit on how much you want to just pump more people into the southeast as opposed to trying to have that be more equally dispersed. We're almost at time, so Philip, do you want to comment very briefly on Kevin's question about the extent to which the government has the ability to address kind of whatever it is that's holding capital markets back in the rest of the country?
The French have already done it. Set of BPI France, designed precisely for that reason, with an economic geography banking interaction. That system in France is almost identical. The difference in France is that the cities are much more productive, the second and third tier cities, the gaps between Paris and the rest are much, much narrower in the UK. Paul's done a lot of work on this stuff. But the access to capital problem, the centralisation capital, the French realised it very early on, and what they did was they developed a system where they took hybrid features from the European Investment Bank and the KfW in Germany. In Germany, the KfW provides the anchor. It's got about 15% of German GDP on its books. That's the big German internal domestic development bank, but it channels those resources through the banking system, because the banking system in Germany is so decentralized. You've got the Landesbank and the Sparkassen, that's exactly how they work. That channels the finance through to the Mittelstand, the small businesses in the Mittelstand, which are the fabric that holds the German economy together. So they don't need to decentralize because they've got a decentralized system, which relates to your point, but they use the anchor institutions in finance to make that work. In France, they also had a highly centralised banking system, which, like the UK, had become more centralised. I think it's almost about exactly the same structure, in effect, isn't it? So what they did was the opposite. They set up a development banking system, which is BPI France, which has 50 full-service officers. It's basically backed by the state in terms of the guarantees. It's effectively an enormous Handelsbanken with state guarantees. And it's precisely works like that. Those individual 50 units around the country, their remit is to serve the local economy. They work with other banking systems, and they have basically full service offices. So it's all about local knowledge, local capital provision for local businesses. That's precisely, if they can do it, there's no reason we can't do it, which is what we talk to people like British Business Bank about.
Thank you. We should draw to a close now because we're out of time. I think it's an interesting question there still about why private banks would be leaving money on the table in some sense and not taking up these opportunities regionally. Perhaps we can get this afternoon into more of the why that's happening. For now, thank you to all of our speakers. There's going to be tea and coffee downstairs. If you go to the end stay in this room, but to the end there's a staircase. You can go down, and then please come back promptly at 10 to so that we can hear from Andy Burnham. But for now, thank you to our speakers. Good. Hello, everyone. For those of you who've joined just recently or joining online and haven't met me already, I'm Helen Miller. I'm the director of the IFS. I'm going to be very, very quick because I want to have the maximum time for our keynote speaker, who really needs no introductions. We are absolutely delighted that Andy Burnham, who, as you all know, is Mayor of Greater Manchester, and previously to that was a Labour MP, is joining us to share his experiences from Manchester. So you are first going to see a little video, which is very exciting, and then Andy will come up and do his talk, and then after that there will be some time for questions. So let me stop there and just say again thank you so much to Andy, and enjoy.
raises the bar once again on growth. We're publishing for the first time our cluster map, 5 defined locations across the city region, which, as this century develops, will host industrial clusters of global significance. And I think you might see an illustration of where those clusters are in a moment. In other words, a concrete plan to reindustrialise the birthplace of the Industrial Revolution, bringing high-value employment to all parts of Greater Manchester. This was the missing piece in our growth jigsaw. And this is the moment on Greater Manchester's journey which many people have been waiting to see, because they've seen the change in our city centre. And for those of you who've been recently, it is a dramatic change. But until now, they've not had a clear sense of the type of jobs that will be found in the boroughs surrounding our city centres. So today we can give them clarity on the new industries that will surround our city, bringing prosperity to more places and better prospects for young people for the next century and more. Since Theresa May's government, we've been working on the concept of a local industrial strategy. It was the right thing to do, and we've never given up on it, even though central government did. We've been developing and refining our thinking on 5 core sectors: creative industries, digital and tech, life sciences, advanced manufacturing and materials, and green tech. And you can see those are the sectors, and you can see the map where those clusters will be based. What makes Greater Manchester's work on the local industrial strategy stand apart is that we are the only city region in the UK to have done the hard work of both developing sector-specific plans for those 5 sectors, but also a spatial plan underpinning it all, grasping the difficult nettle of land allocation and greenbelt release, giving us defined geographical locations to host those 5 global clusters. So the result is a UK growth plan, a growth plan unique in the UK for its precision, credibility and ambition. It's not wishful thinking or pie in the sky. All 5 clusters are either built or being built right now. Our creative cluster, you can see in the teal colour on the map, controversial, is well established Media City, and we'll be working with owners Landsec to double it in size over the next decade. That is their plan, and it's a very exciting one. Our digital and tech cluster is to be found in the city centre. We've been the fastest growing digital and tech economy in Europe in the last decade. And as part of it, we have the largest AI sector by headcount outside of London and the South East, and a cyber strength that in the next decade will be built out by the development of a government digital campus close to Manchester Piccadilly. Our life sciences cluster can be found on the Oxford Road corridor, pale blue, sky blue, city blue. And it is obviously linked to the biggest hospital trust in Europe, Manchester Foundation Trust, and it will soon see the global asset of the UK Biobank take up new headquarters on the nearby Manchester Science Park. Make no mistake, this is truly of global significance. So then you come to our 2 emerging clusters, one in the northeast of Greater Manchester, linking Bury, Rochdale and Oldham, and one in the southwest, linking Salford and Trafford. So up in the northeast, we officially broke ground in November 2025 on the Sustainable Materials and Manufacturing Centre at Atom Valley in Rochdale. It's the name of the cluster. And we did that in partnership with the University of Manchester. This is a major project aimed at creating a world-class hub for advanced materials and manufacturing. Over the coming years, this cluster, linking those 3 boroughs, aims to host over 20,000 high-value jobs. And we've protected that land for that high-value employment. For those of you who know our city region, it would have been so easy to let that land for warehousing or distribution logistics, because it's right on the M62, but we didn't. We kept a high ambition to bring those jobs to a part of our city region that most need those good jobs. It's going to be complemented by the other emerging cluster, a green energy cluster in the southwest of Greater Manchester. Again, in November 2025, Highview Power broke ground on the world's largest liquid air energy storage plant in Carrington, backed by a £300 million investment. It's the first of its kind in the UK, one of a few in the world, which will transform the economics of wind energy by capturing and storing in liquid form the output of the turbines through the night. That's often when wind energy can't put into the grid because the grid's full. So this changes that. And it will provide enough clean energy to power nearly 500,000 homes. The first phase should be operational later this year, and it will sit alongside a green hydrogen production facility, a battery storage plant, and the existing Carrington power station. This green energy cluster is well located to connect with the new HyNet hydrogen pipeline linking Liverpool and Manchester through the Manchester Ship Canal, which the government has backed, and it opens up the prospect of Greater Manchester hosting one of the world's first green hydrogen economies. So, these 5 clusters, as they build out, will support businesses active in these sectors in satellite sites across our 10 boroughs, for instance, life sciences in Bolton. It is all supported by the change which has already taken place in our city over the last decade. It is now a major centre for professional services, and with the support of all 6 of our universities, it has built out a research infrastructure in those universities to support an innovation-led economy. Our annual average growth of 3.1% over the last decade, double the UK rate, and which, according to provisional 2023 data, has taken the Greater Manchester economy to over the 100 billion mark, could, with the right support from the national level, accelerate its growth rate further between 2025 and 2035. But whether that comes or not, we will now be backing ourselves and taking a more intentional approach to investment. Just as we took public control of our buses, we will now be doing the same with our investment strategy. Late last year, we launched the Greater Manchester Good Growth Fund, and we will use it to advance place-based regeneration and housing growth in our boroughs, as well as backing the sectoral cluster plan I have set out. And we'll do that with a mixture of our own borrowing, partnership with the Greater Manchester Pension Fund, and we hope other national funders like the National Wealth Fund. It is a new, more assertive and confident approach, drawing on what we have learned over the last decade. It's an interventionist approach. We can't wait for the market to magically back our places. It didn't happen in the past. So instead, we are making the weather ourselves. That is what the Good Growth Fund is set up to do. But by making the initial investments and setting out the long-term ambition, we create the conditions for the private sector to come in later down the line. It is why we have a 10-year pipeline of investment projects and are looking for investor partners. But I do want to make something clear. I hope some of them are listening today, but I want them to understand something, knowing, as you know, the kind of place that Greater Manchester is, the way that it thinks and works. We want the right partners on this decade of good growth. We don't want exploitative or extractive growth. The north of England has had too much of that in the past. This is about growth which recycles wealth back into our communities, not siphoning it out, creates pathways for our young people, and offers good, secure jobs for our residents. We want investment partners who share those values, who subscribe to the Greater Manchester tradition of economic and social progress going hand in hand. So, for instance, we will link funding distributed from our Good Growth Fund to our Good Employment Charter and our Good Landlord Charter. We will link it to the supply of 45-day work placements, work experience placements for our young people, and to apprenticeships and degree apprenticeships. So we create a path for everybody into this new and growing Greater Manchester economy. Now, you might be asking yourself as you sit there thinking, well, how has Greater Manchester managed to get itself to this point where it can be so confident and clear about what it is doing and where it is going? And the truth is, it goes way back before me. I'm not going to stand here and try and take the credit, because people in our city region have been working at this for decades, 4 decades, and they've done the hard yards of getting regional growth going. Because of all of that, though, we now know what works and what doesn't, because we've pretty much tried it all. For years, regional growth in Britain was like the Holy Grail. Everyone said they wanted it, but no one knew how to find it. But finally, the English cities are rising again, and the catalyst is devolution. No one has done any of this for us. We have done it for ourselves. In our case, the main foundation of the success of Manchesterism, as it has been called, is the creation of a different political culture, the polar opposite of the Whitehall and Westminster way. Manchesterism starts with setting higher ambitions for what we can be in the 21st century than were ever set for us at a national level. In fact, pre-devolution, there was no ambition for us or the other English city regions anywhere outside of the Golden Triangle. Devolution has allowed us to set ambitions when there were none there before. And then from those ambitions, we set out a long-term, patient approach to achieving them, rejecting the short-termism endemic in the Whitehall culture. Manchesterism then seeks to roll back the 1980s and take more local public control over the essential drivers of the economy, such as housing, utilities, transport, and education. It rejects unnecessary fragmentation and competition in public services, and instead is highly integrated and collaborative. A whole place approach, uniting all sectors, public, private, academic, community, voluntary, and faith. All threads woven together, rather than an approach driven by the partial and often conflicting positions of the Whitehall silos. And the operating principle underneath all of this is place first, not party first. This is important because it gives business the confidence to walk in and engage more deeply in a place-first context. And the resulting strong partnership we have built with our private sector is critical to our success. It is business-friendly socialism. These are the ingredients of growth. It takes time to develop them, and they are hard to achieve. But the patience to do so over decades is now paying huge dividends for Greater Manchester. We have built a new politics and are now building a new economy as a result of that. Other city regions like Liverpool have also started to break out of the long-term low-growth trends using devolution to create a new political culture. And credit goes to Mayor Steve Rotherham for achieving that. It all means that we've arrived at the point where the debate in this country is no longer what do we need to do to get regional growth, as it once would have been at a conference like this and people casting around for ideas. We know the answer. We know what gets growth. We've laid it out for you. Instead, the question is, how much growth do Whitehall and Westminster actually want? What is their ambition for the English regions and as to what we can be in the 21st century? I say that because parts of the Whitehall system still continue to resist devolution on bread and butter issues where the growth imperative demands that devolution. This debate is rapidly coming down to an issue of where power in Britain lies and whether Whitehall is prepared to let go. A clear test for this is the Department for Education's continued resistance to meaningful devolution over post-16 education and skills policy. The logic of the cluster map behind me and in front of you is that Greater Manchester skills needs will increasingly specialise in those places in the next decade. The highly specific nature of the activities within our clusters means the employers will need a much more agile, integrated and responsive skills system than exists at present. We believe the city region should be able to move away from the fragmented approach of the past and have the ability to commission our skills system to deliver to the sectoral needs of our fast-changing economy. as well as taking devolved control of the growth and skills levy. Another area where a more devolved approach is needed is housing. Rather than a project-by-project approach, we believe Homes England should use the innovation of the Greater Manchester Good Growth Fund to operate more as a portfolio investor, like the Greater Manchester Pension Fund or the National Wealth Fund, agreeing high-level outputs in return for investment. Crucially, rather than just chasing general numerical house-building targets, we need to agree a new target on reaching the tipping point in Greater Manchester of building more council and social homes every year than we are losing through right to buy. Sadly, we're still in a net loss position, and like every other part of England, we need to move to a net gain position, as there is no way of achieving all of our economic and social ambitions for our residents whilst we remain in the grip of a housing crisis. So on skills and housing, we need to come to a new consensus with the government on devolution arrangements that will drive maximum growth and make the biggest social impact. However, in other areas, the government deserves great credit for making faster progress than expected. The first sign of fiscal devolution, in the form of the overnight visitor levy, is extremely welcome. Supporting growth requires investment, for instance, in extra policing or extra transport to deal with the extra visitors in the city. And it would be regressive and unfair to ask city regions like ours to fund it all from the council tax. It is right that visitors make a modest contribution too. We are also encouraged by the potential local role in the planning of major infrastructure as set out by the government last week in its announcement on Northern Powerhouse Rail. Rather than imposing substandard infrastructure, as too often it has been the case in the North in the past, we are being given the opportunity to specify the most ambitious design for Manchester Piccadilly and then develop new mechanisms to contribute to the building of it, such as long-term business rates retention and land value capture. This is highly significant, as it finally opens up the opportunity for devolved authorities to get their hands on the major levers of growth. For a city region that helped build from the bottom up the first commuter railway exactly 200 years ago, it feels finally like history is turning full circle. So, what does this all mean in conclusion? Freeing up all of England's regions to take more control of their affairs and their destiny is the way to build a new politics, and through that, a new economy. It is the way Britain will become more functional again, and the way we start to close the inequalities between people and places that you have been discussing today. In recent days, we've heard the claim from the new British right that Britain is broken. Well, I can tell them in no uncertain terms that Greater Manchester isn't broken. But if they believe what they are saying, can I ask them what and who they think broke it? I know what I think. It was the four horsemen of Britain's apocalypse: deregulation, privatisation, austerity, and Brexit. The deregulation and privatisation of the 80s and 90s created a race to the bottom. It left Britain unable to guarantee the standard of its infrastructure, as we've seen with the water industry. It left people and businesses paying more for the essentials. We had unaffordable bus fares when I came in as mayor in 2017. And it left the country losing control of the basic ability to manage its costs, chasing rents through the benefits system. The austerity and Brexit of the 2010s deepened the hole by hollowing out English cities and towns, and of course our councils. It has all combined to leave the country in a low-growth doom loop. Our shallow adversarial political system has shown itself incapable of lifting us out of it, and it only adds to the volatility. So we do find ourselves stuck in a rut and in hock to the bond markets. The arch-Thatcherites of reform talk of taking back control, but in fact they are the ones who gave that control away. This is a decisive moment in our politics when the British left should go out confidently and win the argument as to who broke Britain and what will fix it. The lesson from Manchester is that to do it, we must build a new politics, more collaborative, so that we can take the long-term prudent approach to repairing the economy. Manchesterism is a modern and functional response to the high inequality, low growth trap that came from the 1980s drive to over-centralise political power in the Treasury and privatise economic power. The New Right were the cheerleaders of those changes, and they simply do not have the same lived experience in the parts of the country as we do, where the damage was worse. They don't understand, therefore, what happened. Matching England's devolved authorities with a national political system that thinks and works in the same way, rather than at cross purposes, as it is right now, would get the whole country pulling in the same direction. It would create the circumstances in which we could progressively retake public control of those essential enablers of the economy, and, for instance, build the council and social homes that would once again provide the foundation for working class aspiration in this country and simultaneously allow a stronger grip on the public finances, providing reassurance to the bond markets. On those solid foundations, we can then build a higher value, future-facing, more productive economy, similar to the plan for Greater Manchester I have laid out today, in which people are set up to succeed, and there is a path for everyone. This is Manchesterism, and yes, as someone once famously said, it does mean doing things very differently. Thank you very much.
Andy, we'll use a few minutes to take some questions. I'm going to abuse my position as chair and ask you the first question, Andy. So you spoke there a lot about kind of how you've used the powers from devolution. Thinking about the next steps, I mean, where do you think the biggest bang for the buck would be in terms of devolution? To what extent is it about devolving the powers for Manchester and other regions to be able to do new things, and or the kind of the ability to raise the revenue through which you might do that? I guess related to that, to what extent do you think different regions might need different things, or actually Manchester's now set a blueprint that others should be following?
Well, there always will be differences between the places. So, you know, a cluster plan for the West Midlands would look different to ours, but I think the fundamentals are the same. I think increasingly we are all converging in our thinking, and the combined authorities of England are, you know, increasingly sharing experience and moving in a similar direction, of course, with a local flavour and local difference. But that's how it should be. But we are really clear that the template we're outlining is the way to have a higher growth economy, and then to support more residents into benefiting from that higher growth economy. And actually, if you follow the logic of what I'm saying, reshape the state completely. You know, we have an integrated settlement now, which is a sort of consolidated single budget that comes from Whitehall. Everything should go through that. Then you got the opportunity to streamline the state at a local level, and you get the most, if you like, impactful use of public money, because it's all coordinated in terms of how you're using it. It doesn't, to me, make sense still to be spending billions through outsourced top-down provision in the benefit system. You know, a sort of anonymous computer says no type thing that our residents fear interacting with. You know, that the local state now should be completely empowered so that everything within it is coherent and it's all going to the same plan. I think we're in a sort of middle ground at the moment, if I could put it that way, as I said, where you've got some really positive examples of devolution, but then some of the bread and butter things still not, you know, homes and skills still not quite knitting in to the plan. But then on another front, the fiscal devolution we're beginning to see is incredible progress. So I don't necessarily feel it's not moving quick enough. We are moving very quick now, and actually what I've said to you today is we're doing it more and more for ourselves now, using the heft of our integrated settlement, the confidence to do our own borrowing, the partnership with other big funders like the Greater Manchester Pension Fund. You know, we've kind of broken into this new decade, the second decade of devolution in Greater Manchester is already very different. But my point, though, in the speech was, how much does Whitehall and Westminster actually want to empower this? Because there is still a sense of a wrestling match for the power, in the sense that the power still has to reside here. I would say that is a barrier to growth, and it becomes increasingly incoherent to do that when you see the progress that we're making. So it implies, I'm afraid, massive change for the British state. But as I was saying at the end, we can't stay where we are. We are in a rut. We have to break out of that rut. We've kind of come, in some ways, the country has stumbled across the answer, and I think it's this new map of bottom-up devolution. Now that we've created it, we should just absolutely lean into it, and I think it is a route to a higher growth Britain.
Great, thank you. Let's take a couple of questions before we have to let Andy go. And there are roving microphones, and I'm going to be split for choice, aren't I? I'm going to go with the people I saw first, and I apologise to everyone else I didn't see. Oh, sorry, I was actually going to come down here to the gentleman in the middle. Sorry, I'm going first on a purely first come first served basis, so I don't have to pick favourites. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Joe from MHCLG. Something you mentioned, and I can't remember your specific wording, but it was something about making sure that we're sort of aligned in our general focus nationally. But you also spoke a lot about, devolving and empowering these parts. How does that, not that you're contradicting yourself, but how does that square, and how do we find a good balance of, making sure we're relatively aligned, but then also giving places like the power to make the decisions and choose the themes which they want?
Yeah.
Well, can I take two at a time,
yes,
if you don't
sure,
mind? So,
sure.
Victor, can we come down to the front? We'll take Xiaowe's question, and then I'll let you take a couple together so we don't run out of time. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Xiaowe from the IFS. You talked about the importance of long-term planning for investment and growth, sort of in contrast to the short-termism that often characterises politics. What do you think it is about the institutions in Manchester that enables that sort of long-term planning?
Yeah, good question.
I'll let you take both of them. Thank you.
Well, thank you both. Joe, I should say, and it didn't perhaps come over in the speech, but I am hugely admiring of MHCLG in the way that you have supported us as a department. And so I'm not making a sort of, a sweeping criticism here. MHCLG have genuinely been brilliant to work with and have moved us further than I thought was possible in many ways. Under the last government, when Michael Gove negotiated the Trailblazer deal, and more recently in the task and finish process, we were in with your department and the Treasury. So in some ways, there's really amazing progress has been made. But I still sense there's holding back in parts of the system, and as I say, it's on quite critical issues. I don't think there's any contradiction. What we need is if we're going to have mission-led government, and that is still an if, I think we should. I think the Prime Minister was right about that. It really needs to be lived now. And if we're going to be a growth mission government more than anything, it does require real change in Whitehall, not just saying they support growth. It does mean you've got to do things quite fundamentally differently, because growth is, by definition, nurtured from the bottom up. It can't be ordained from the top down. You kind of have to set places up like us to go out and get the growth. We're the ones who will go and get it. And I still feel that's not, it's not understood. There is still the old departmental position will come before the pro-growth, bolder position. Even in the Treasury, there still might be an impulse to control public spending more than invest to create a growing, productive economy. And those tensions, I think, haven't been yet resolved. But they could be because of the progress that's been making. And I think the state just has to, if you like, reprogram itself to work through integrated authorities at the local level, and then allow a very different approach to the way outcomes are achieved. That it's like we've set these things up, but we still haven't reprogrammed the state at a national level. I think if it was a similar long-term pro-growth, patient approach, backing combined authorities on that journey, I think there's no contradiction there. To me. And when it comes to public services, we've said we'll be the prevention demonstrator for the country. Let us intervene very differently in how we support our residents in a more preventative way, and then achieve the waiting list challenges for the Department of Health, the people off benefits and into work challenges for the DWP. It just might be the same quite practical intervention on someone's housing situation or their debt problem might solve a whole load of issues that are kind of arising in other government departments. And it's just that mindset shift has not yet fully landed, but it needs to, I think, if we're to go to the next level. And how have we managed to build it? As I say, it's been built by people long before me. It is the Manchester culture. You know, it's an approach, I think, where people going back to the sort of 80s and then particularly in the 90s under Sir Howard and Sir Richard, you know, they just decided that everyone had to lock in on this together to be able to do it. It couldn't be flaky, it couldn't be short term. And so the universities massively bought in, and we're really grateful to them. But also the private sector. We built a business culture through Midas. People will know maybe our Inwood Investment Agency. When they bring new investors in, we speak to them like family, and we work with them like that, you know, and sort of knit them into everything else that we're doing. It's a culture, is the way I would describe it. It's a culture that is place first, not party first, and therefore it does allow people to buy in. And that was my point. You know, Westminster is party first, not place first, and hence people might enter into it with some trepidation because of the agendas. And when you operate a truly place-first approach, as we try to do in Greater Manchester, there's always politics at the fringes, of course there is, but we do work hard at that. That is what builds the trust. That builds the sort of, you know, the confidence in the long-term journey. And as I say, it's been built over many, many years. It's very, very hard to build, but once you've got it, it's truly priceless.
Brilliant. So I think, sadly, we're out of time, and I think we'll have to let you go and get back to the good work you've set out. But let me say a huge thank you again for that. You've given us lots of food for thought, and I'm sure that those ideas will continue in what we do later in the day, and we'll pick up on some of those ideas. But again, Andy, thank you so much.
You're welcome. Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you.
I'm going to invite my other panellists to come up to the stage. Maybe I'll move along. Where do you want us? Wherever you like, really. Do you want to come up? Does everyone want to come up now? Paul? Paul? Yeah, do you want to come up now? Okay, wonderful. So now we have a chance to discuss and keep going that discussion on policy. We have three very impressive people to talk to us. What I'm going to do in the interest of time is I will introduce them kind of one at a time as I ask them their first questions, and then we'll have some discussion. So we are first going to hear, and I should say I'm going to give you a brief introduction so we maximise hearing from them, but they all have very impressive bios, but they apologies if I missed the most exciting bit. So we are first going to hear from Lindsay McMillan. She's Professor of Economics at UCL and Founding Director of the UCL Centre for Education Policy and Equalising Opportunities. She also sits impressively on very many boards. I'm not quite sure you've had the time for this, but including the Labour Market Advisory Board for the DWP and the Opportunities Mission Expert Reference Groups for DFE. So lots of relevant experience there. And Lindsay, I think you're going to tell us a bit about the role of education policy in kind of regional inequalities and kind of getting the skills that allow people to move to opportunity or to achieve opportunities. I'm also interested in your views, picking up from what Andy was just saying about kind of the role of different players in this market in creating skills.
Okay, so kind of an ode to education policy from me, I guess, but I'll come back to the labour market afterwards. And I should say I have been to Manchester recently. I was there on Saturday to watch the Mighty Reds destroy the Blues, and I enjoyed it very much. So I'm really glad that we heard about Manchester today. But back to serious stuff. Well, it is serious, but, you know, other serious stuff. From a research perspective, both economic theory and also applied economic research really emphasises the key role of education policy, and in particular, reducing educational inequalities in both improving equality of opportunity, but also reducing kind of geographical inequalities. Now, this is a really complex picture. As Sonia really eloquently, I think, explained from a paper which is frankly a nightmare to explain because it's so complicated, and it took us a really long time to write because of that. There's kind of two different ways you can do this. So in some places, like the regional cities, as for an example, we just need to raise the standards of educational attainment for all people, regardless of their backgrounds. We're not doing enough in those places. In other places, we need both high standards but also a real laser-sharp focus on reducing educational inequalities to compensate for young people from disadvantaged backgrounds to make sure that they do have those equal opportunities. And if some places are doing this better than others, then we are going to get those geographical inequalities exacerbated through the education system. Now, it's really nice that Sonia drew out two neighbouring boroughs, two neighbouring local authorities, Buckinghamshire and Oxfordshire. For any education policy nerds in the audience, can you think of anything that might be different between those two areas? Buckinghamshire has grammar schools. Oxfordshire does not. Buckinghamshire has very limited equality of opportunity. Oxfordshire does not. I'm not saying it's all because of grammar schools, but our paper was able to show, and it was something Sonia didn't get to, that areas with better access to high-quality education and less academic segregation offer more equal opportunities. And this is really consistent with what we know in the economics of education literature more generally. Higher quality schools lead to better labour market outcomes, and selective schooling systems exacerbate economic inequalities. Now, there's two parts to this. So these education policies are obviously related to later labour market outcomes, but they're also accessed unequally. So we know that high-attaining schools are based in more affluent catchment areas, just based on the way that our admissions policies in schools are set up. We also know that more affluent children are more likely to access selective schools, grammar schools, regardless of their performance at Key Stage 2 at the end of primary school, because of the way in which parents from more affluent parents are able to invest in their children through tutoring to ensure they get access to these types of schools. So broadly, the differences in education policy that we're offering young people, both between places but also within places to people from different backgrounds, plays a really key role in driving equality of opportunity and geographical inequalities. A previous report we wrote back in 2020 for the Social Mobility Commission, called The Long Shadow of Deprivation, we were able to show that educational inequalities really do account for large differences across places everywhere. So if we can reduce those educational inequalities, we're well on our way. But crucially, and I think the gender point really comes in here, that report and our new work has also shown that childhood circumstances, the disadvantage that people experience growing up, really does persist also beyond the education system. So if you compare people, young people from different backgrounds with the same educational qualifications, typically young people from more affluent backgrounds go on to earn more in the labour market than someone from a more deprived background with the same educational qualifications. And they earn even more in the areas with the least opportunities. Now, the way I think about this is that when you're in a place with limited opportunity, all other things equal, childhood disadvantage just becomes a much more important feature when you're going into the labour market and defining your future. That long shadow of background really does persist if there's more competition for limited opportunities. And this really emphasises then the crucial role beyond education of labour market policy in this space. And in particular, the need for this join-up between the education sector and what comes next. And this is the really tricky bit. This is where our levers really start to disintegrate. We have great levers in the education space, and then when we move into beyond that, we start to lose control over what we can do. And I think the work by Philip and colleagues here is really important for us understanding the way that different contributions, barriers to investment, interact outside of London. And obviously we've just heard the speech from Andy about ways that we can kind of counteract that. But if an area has limited economic opportunity and young people growing up in those places don't want to move away, which, by the way, is fair and a justifiable choice, and as Zhao Wei has shown, is more likely to be those who are lower attaining, are the non-graduates, this ultimately devalues the education we're offering in that place in the first place. Research to support that shows that areas with the lowest attendance in the education system are the areas with the lowest employment and wages. Why go to school if there is no point? So we're stuck in this vicious cycle of no opportunities in the labour market, and young people we're expecting to go through the education system but offering very little thereon afterwards. So just to summarise, And as Andy said, if we really are going to stick with this mission-based approach, for example, the opportunities mission, we need a join-up between education policy and what comes next in the labour market. We need departments working together, and we need to design policies that are built with that joined-up approach. And I think that's where the question about what level we work this at really comes in. We've got a really centralised system through to 16. Post-16, things start to fragment. They don't fragment if your kid's on an academic path, but if you're on a non-academic path, they do start to fragment at that place. And by the way, that's where we're losing a lot of young people in terms of the youth labour market puzzle that we're currently facing. And then we've got a set of essentially completely localised economies. Now, that disintegration from centralised to localised is something we really need to deal with and work out how we're going to do that join up of policy between the education system and the labour market while we move from that tight control at the central system. Now, I don't want to get into the politics of budgets and the need to to kind of pass post-16 budgets down to different levels of devolution, but I do think we do need to take seriously the kind of different levels at which we are making decisions as we move through that pipeline for young people.
I'm going to bring you in. So Anne-Marie Canning is currently the Opportunity Mission Challenge Director at the UKRI. And among the many previous things she's done, she was the Independent Chair of the Department for Education's Bradford Opportunity Area. So Anne-Marie, I know you've thought a lot about this link between skills policy and labour market policy, but also more broadly about what it takes to make systems work in a place. So share your reflections on that with us.
Yeah, thanks. So I'm currently leading the Research and Development Missions Accelerator Programme at UKRI, which more of later. I'm actually going to talk to you about my experiences in Bradford, which Sonia mentioned as being one of the places experiencing that extreme lack of opportunity and sort of negative outcomes. So for those of you who don't know, the Opportunity Area was a programme that was launched by the DFE in 2017. It gave away power to 12 different places in the UK that were most challenged in terms of social mobility. And that was measured by the opportunity to get a decent level of education and get a decent job at the end of it. And I was the independent chair of the Bradford Opportunity Area. Now, for those of you who know Bradford, it's a big, beautiful place. It's the UK's youngest city. If we don't get social mobility right in Bradford, there are very serious consequences. And for me, it's really an example of how we can take action in a place to improve the conditions for young people and their families. So those 12 places, they had £72 million between them. Not a vast amount of money, but what that money allowed us to do is to convene people round a table from all different parts of civil society, from education, from business, from policing, to say, what do our young people need and what's our common plan? Now, I can't tell you everything about what we did, but we set a number of priorities, and one of them was to start challenging our systems in Bradford to work together in the best interests of children. A great example of this was our work with the Born in Bradford cohort study, where we were able to link together health and education data for the very first time in the UK. Absurd. And the first thing we found were 3,000 children who couldn't read because they didn't have the glasses they needed on their faces. We knew they needed glasses, and teachers were trying to educate children who couldn't see their book and couldn't see the screen at the front of the classroom. And what that takes to get systems like that working together, I used to imagine it was like rugby. It was a contact sport. It was heavy duty, consistently pushing together systems to say, this is the unifying priority for children. We are obliged to work together to make serious headway in this area. And from there, we were able to do things like convince PricewaterhouseCoopers to move large parts of their Leeds operation into Bradford, where we knew there were qualified young people desperate for jobs right on their doorstep. And that continues to this day. Now, you may think those are very tactical things, but it shows you something, which is pushing systems together. Yes, it's a contact sport. It relies heavily on relationships. It relies heavily on an independent broker, someone who is acting in an independent capacity to say, this is what children need in this place. It needs people who can work with that data husbandry to make sense of the story of what kids need right now. And it needs a bit of money, but not always the sort of mega bucks that you might imagine. Small amounts of money can really move us on by operating in that space between systems. Now, I've been asked what it takes to get systems working together like that, and I've described some of the conditions in a place. The reality is that central government can help to create those conditions. Small amounts of money, policies in education and health that allow us to work together much more easily. But it also shows us that it is absolutely imperative that local communities and leaders in institutions write the plan. They know the place, they know the kids, their hearts are embedded in Bradford, and they will fight to make it a better place for children and young people. And I think for us in Bradford, the real moment was getting the story straight of saying, no one's coming to save us. We're holding the pen. It's up to us to make this happen. Yes, people can help us, but we know the priorities. And so what we can see now, when the opportunity area money came to an end, we continued. And I just think that's a remarkable achievement in a very resource-strapped set of institutions and organisations. We've become an independent charity, providing backbone support for systems, organisations and places to work together. Now, I'm going to move on to something else, because I think if there was a criticism of the work we did in the opportunity area, yes, it was organised through institutions and systems. I think we didn't engage enough with communities and individuals, and particularly parents. And it's something I'm hoping to try and right in this new job. So we're doing all sorts of interesting, innovative, experimental work around special educational needs, children in temporary accommodation, a whole set of things that have a terrible effect on education and development outcomes for children and young people, but exist outside of the education sphere. And one of the things I'm really interested in is how we create more opportunity-rich environments for children and young people. Now, I had a really weird experience of being one of the data points in Sonia's data set, having been born in 1986 in a pit village outside of Doncaster. That place is an opportunity desert. It was then and it is now. And it doesn't have to be like that. And one of the reasons it was an opportunity desert is there were just so few institutions to come together. So few places where people could gather and talk about common concerns for their children. And I tell you what it led to. It led to a feeling of feeling stuck. Fiona Hillman's term, there's nothing for you here. That's what it felt like. And there's no reason for it to be that way, because when I talk to parents, their number one motivation in life is to create a better future for their children. And I'm interested in how we can start to take action together to get the expertise of local people saying, here are some assets, and then we go out and say, come on in. Here are the things we need for children in this place right now. So we understand the map of opportunity in a place, but also we know how we can start to dock in different interventions, different funds, different opportunities for children and young people. And I'll end with this quote. It's always stuck in my mind since I heard it about 10 years ago, which is, if people don't think they have the power to solve their problems, they won't even think about how to solve them. And it strikes me that's a key part of what we do next in terms of building opportunity-rich environments and starting to break some of those patterns that Sonia described at the beginning of today's session.
Brilliant, thank you, Anne-Marie. Paul, let's bring you in. So Paul Collier is the Professor of Economics and Public Policy at the Blavatnik School of Government in Oxford, has written various books, including one called Left Behind. Paul, you've worked on regional policy for very many years in lots of different countries. I'm particularly interested in your take on how you've seen these kinds of things work in other places. I mean, what are the international lessons of what we can learn from?
Yeah, I thought Andy Burnham spoke very well, and I really agreed very, very much with a lot of things he said. But let me start, Sonia, with you actually started with talking about Blackpool, and you were. I couldn't believe it that you were fussing about its place of considerable inequality in life chances. And I thought, does anybody here know Blackpool? I mean, I've got relatives there, right? Anybody who knows Blackpool, what strikes you is not inequality of life experiences, life opportunities. What strikes you is Blackpool is number one in the country for one thing. Does anybody know? It's not life opportunities, it's death chances. It is number one in the country for adult male suicides, because it is an opportunity desert. Number 2 in the country, incidentally, is Grimsby, which I also know. Right? I actually brought together the local government in Blackpool and Grimsby to have a session at the Blavatsky School. Right? And they're rehearsing tragedies. Tragedies. Right? Why are these the number 1 and number 2 places for adult male suicide? Because they are opportunity deserts. Lindsay, at some stage, I'll talk to you about why Oxfordshire is not a paradise, and Oxford is not a centre of equality. It is about the richest city in the country. It is massively unequal, and Oxfordshire itself is clusters of fantastic differences in opportunities. Have you been to Didcot, Lindsay? Didcot is not a centre of opportunity. It's a centre of tragedy and missed opportunities, and a totally different class from North Oxford, where I live. Right? So there's so much wrong with this country. But let's start with one thing that Andy Burnham was really very good at was giving credit to the Manchester of the past. And I just want to enlarge on that because it establishes what's really missing in Britain. Why is Manchester such a success today? Because of one guy called Howard Bernstein. Who knows about Howard Bernstein? 1, 2, 3, a few, okay. So, good. So what did Howard Bernstein do? Howard Bernstein left school at 16 and joined Manchester City Council as a tea boy. He then rose because he was so smart, something he wouldn't have been able to do now because he wouldn't have had the educational credentials, right? It tells you how we've over-credentialized things, right? So he rose to become the chief executive of Manchester City Council. And there he built a big team, a professional local government civil service, which was so competent, it knew so much more about Manchester. It built the data which enabled Manchester civil servants to out-argue the idiots in Whitehall. Whitehall recruitment is the Treasury recruits fast track into the Treasury. It's most analogous to a monastery. It takes people when they're very young, and then it works them to death. Either they move within Whitehall, or they leave, but there is no late entry into the Treasury. Any other civil service, even highly centralized ones like France, the French elite civil service is full of people who are professionally trained and a revolving door between the private sector and the civil service. So that Treasury is unique in having kids who enter at about 24, 25, and then are assigned enormous responsibilities, such as running the bus system in Manchester. That's one of the achievements of Andy Burnham was to get the right to set his own bus routes, which is just a height of absurdity. So what is needed is to build in all the local governments, all the city region authorities of Britain, the same sort of civil service that Manchester's had for years. And yes, it takes a long time. You can destroy regional governments pretty fast, and that's indeed what happened during the austerity phase. Right? But to rebuild them takes a long time. As Howard Bernstein began, this is a 40-year-old process. Right? So it will be a long-term investment. The Treasury doesn't do long-term investments. The Treasury is amazingly short-termist. Right? The horizon for Treasury is 3 years. I'll close with a story of pots. When I was working with Michael Gove, I persuaded the Ministry of Local Government and Communities to count how many separate pots there were giving money to local government. We discovered, first we thought there were 80, and then we kept discovering more, because there is no central record in the Treasury. The Treasury wouldn't tell us how many pots there were, because it didn't know. But anyway, we got up to 115 pots by the time we'd finished. There were this was a 2-year effort to count them. Why did they exist? Because each minister wants 30 seconds on TV to announce a new pot, which his pot or her pot will solve some very important problem. And there the minister gets their 30 seconds on TV. This is the reality of British misgovernance, which is astonishingly bad. Right? This is how Whitehall works. So there were 115 pots. I tried to introduce a rule, could we get rid of some pots? That was absolutely beyond the pay grade of the Ministry of Communities, Housing and Local Government. No, that was impossible. Could we agree to a rule there would be no more new pots? We thought we sort of got that, almost. There are now far more pots than there were then. The Minister of Transport just announced a new one 2 days ago. Appropriately, it's a pot for potholes. So there'll be a Treasury official, aged 25, micromanaging which potholes get filled in which town, right? And the criterion will be that you have to show that filling this pothole pays for itself within the next 3 years. Okay? That's the criterion, 3 years. So just work out which potholes will get filled, because what counts as evidence? It's all bogus. But I work with the civil servants, the local government civil servants, who've had to provide the evidence on this, so I know exactly what's done. Right? And it will be evidence of the potholes are disrupting the flow of traffic. Well, then how important is that? Well, it depends upon how valuable is the traffic, how valuable are the streets, how valuable are the cars that get bumped. And so which potholes will get filled? Kensington and Chelsea. Right? Will they get filled in Bradford? No, they won't. Right? This is the level of absurdity. And that's why we need this radical devolution. And as Andy Burnham said, it's not tinkering at the margins. It's massive shift of power out of Whitehall, which is farcically worse than anything I've sketched so far.
Great, so let's should we do some quick on that? Given that we're near time, so thank you, Paul, Lindsay, and Anne-Marie. Let's take some questions from the audience so that we have time to squeeze them in before we have to get you all to lunch. So put your hands up if you've got a question, and then the roving mic will come to you. So we'll come to here first. Thank you, Rosina.
Thank you very much. There's been a lot of discussion about skills and educational attainment. So my question is, just to kind of think about what the changes and what changes you would think would deliver a better outcome. So let's say you imagine you have a deprived school. So what would be the change in terms of outcomes for 16-year-olds which would suggest that school has now delivered better outcomes?
Great, thank you. Any other questions? There's a question at the back.
Hi, Greg Wade, Head of Innovation Policy at Universities UK. We've got the 5 missions, with the growth mission being the most important of the 5. And this is leading to lots of consideration, for example, in higher education policy, about concentration, focusing on strengths, winners and losers, which in some ways could be place-blind approaches. So my question is, how important is it that the economic mission relates to the other 4 missions, especially opportunity and health?
Great. Are there any final questions before I put them to our panels? No? Okay. So Lindsay, maybe I'll come to you first. I'm going to add my own question onto all of these in some sense. So there's a specific question there about skills and education. What would look good for 16-year-olds? A broad question about how the mission should link up. I'm also interested in, I'll ask all of you this, that I think everyone can get behind the idea that you devolve some powers, local areas know their areas best, they know what they need. And you can obviously tell stories where that's really beneficial. But there's also, that can also create its own, in the extreme, its own forms of inequality. Because what if you devolve some powers, one area does great, another area does, at what point would the central government want to come in and be an equalising force? So I think some of these, when you think about things like national curriculum or benefit policies, you can see those real tensions at the heart of that. So perhaps you could reflect on that as well, Lindsay.
Okay, so to start with the kind of 16-year-olds question, I think one of the things that's really been very well documented recently in research is the failure of the raising of the participation age policy and its implementation. So I think the idea behind the raising of the participation age from 16 to 18 was correct, but by the time it was implemented, and it's a really good example of how not to implement policy, major parts of it had been torn away and decimated. Crucially, accountability for going to school or turning up at colleges. So we basically gave that accountability to local authorities at the same time as we decimated resources to local authorities, meaning that there is one man in Sunderland who's responsible for checking that everyone's going to FE colleges. That's not enough, frankly. We have a hidden NEET problem, 16 to 18. We have an incentive for kids to sign on to further education college so that their families keep child benefit. You don't get to keep child benefit if you go into an apprenticeship, for example, but we incentivize them to sign up to these college courses that might not be right for them, and then once they've signed up for it, the college gets the money, the kid doesn't go, no one's accountable. So we have a massive problem in the post-16 part of the education system, and that's what I mean about it's fine if you're on an academic track at that point, but if you're not, it falls apart. And the IFS has been really great at documenting the absolute tragedy in terms of the real funding that FE colleges have seen over the last kind of 15 years and the way that that's just declined. They don't have the resource to go and find these kids either. I think we need to really look very seriously at where the accountability lies in the 16 to 18 space, particularly for those young people who we are essentially forcing to continue participation when, frankly, it might not be the best outcome for them, and look at why we're just assuming that everything's okay. Opportunities related to growth. The growth mission might be central, but you cannot have the growth mission, or let me say this another way. If you get the opportunities mission right, it will contribute to growth, because we are missing huge amounts of talent in the country right now. Our productivity gains from getting the right people into the right jobs surely are going to be huge. This happened in the US. There's a good economics paper on this where you look at the contribution of women to the labour market over the last 50 years, and as you freed up women's rights to go out into the labour market, productivity has risen. The same is true for people from low-income backgrounds. We're missing so much talent in the UK, and all of these missions do, I think, feed into the growth mission. The point about that you've asked, which is really important, I think, Helen, is what level is right here. I think the mayoral strategic authorities at least have accountability. These guys are elected, right? And that is more important in some ways, I think, than what we used to do of giving local authorities power. My real concern here is what we do in the places that don't have mayors, right? So if we are going to do this, particularly in the kind of education and skills space, there are still going to be big areas of the country where we are essentially still doing centralised control. So you're fine, well, you might be fine if you give that power to Andy and you're growing up in Manchester, but what are you going to do if you're in one of these places without that? So it's not a simple answer, but I am leaning towards these MSAs, at least because they have accountability, being able to plug some of the gaps from the kind of centralised education system up to 16 to what then comes next in terms of what is needed in these local places for skills delivery and for accountability.
Great. We're slightly running over, but Anne-Marie, do you want... No, that's okay. We're coming lots into a day. Anne-Marie, do you want to comment briefly, then I'll bring Paul in. We should be brief and then let people have their lunches.
Yeah, I mean, Lindsay said it right. I always say, the opportunity mission. It's the clean energy of tomorrow, the safer streets of tomorrow, the NHS of tomorrow, the growth of tomorrow. We have to see it as fundamental, not this nice, cushy, fluffy stuff that we're doing on the end of the missions. I'm pleased to say in the Mission Accelerator programme, we're big on mission interdisciplinarity. So how are they working together to make the most of the investment to get those breakthroughs? But I'll leave it there. I'll just say, around the sort of giving away power and are some places ready to receive that, I think you could develop a way to support communities and places. I don't know why we're so we seem allergic to training people to step up to those roles in public life. And I think we have to accompany, giving away of power with helping people to fulfil that duty effectively for them and for the benefit of broader, communities and places.
Brilliant. Paul, do you want to comment very briefly on the link between the missions?
Yeah, well, missions are a bit of a joke, I think. They change, but the really important thing is shifting budgets. Clearly, there's no money in the centre. And so half of all kids don't go to university. And there's been a massive emphasis upon going to university. But what about half that don't go? What happens to them? They need, and where we're massively failing them, is vocational training. We need much more money in colleges of further education, an emphasis upon vocational skills, which we're very sadly lacking in Britain. Any interviews of firms talks about the total absence of vocational skills. Given there's no money, shifting budget seriously from universities to colleges of further education will be a very feasible thing for the Ministry of Education to do. And that would also send a signal that there's opportunities for the half of kids who don't go to university and probably shouldn't.
Wonderful, thank you. Actually, on that, I should add that tomorrow morning we have another event, actually all about education. We're launching our annual education report, so picking up very much on some of that themes. But for now, let me say a huge thank you to our panel for sharing their expertise. Thank you to all of you for coming. If you would like some lunch before you head off on your way, again, if you go back down to where the teas and coffees are, there are some sandwiches, so feel free to grab some lunch before you go. But thank you for coming.